In video games, there's a specific aspect that's often chased in the pursuit to make a game better or for the least part to impress the audiences. It's something that Crysis pioneered at one point and now is just a recurring theme in most indie survival games. You know what I'm talking about, it's realism. And if we weren't on the same page, then forgive me, but we're talking about realism. Now for a really long time, the phrase, "that's so realistic," was attributed to small little details, like how the world in a video game looks. Textures, polygon count, and the way things were imitated in the game world were what made games realistic. I mean, at one point Half-Life was considered realistic, so think about that. Then slowly it was about gameplay mechanics and features. Ragdoll physics imitated how physics in the real world worked. Kind of. But, you know, because it imitated it, it was then deemed realistic. Then slowly the logic of the real world started applying in games, even in just the slightest way, like how plants would move when you move through it. You know, just all these small little things that just kind of immersed you a bit better into the game. But these little details was the new bar to realism. Then came the Arma franchise, which took realism and turned it into something more. A genre of video games that was focused on hyper-realism. Now, disclaimer, if you do a deep dive, there's probably an earlier game that can be attributed to the rise of hyper-realistic gameplay, but the Arma franchise serves this segment well, and the focus of the segment isn't really to be an extensive history, it's more just like a, oh hey, look guys, these games were kind of cool and realistic at one point, I remember that shit. So, yeah, moving on. And this would lead developers into pushing the boundaries of what is considered realistic, but still fun. This new genre would then lead to the creation of survival games like The Forest, Raft, The Long Dark, 7 Days to Die, and Stranded Deep. Now you may be thinking, but survival games were already a thing before Arma even came out. But before that point, you have to remember that most survival games were kind of arcadey and were really designed to be fun than realistic. Resident Evil and Turok. Both of these games are considered survival games, and yet they aren't really as gritty or as realistic as The Long Dark or The Forest. And that's because simulation wasn't at the core of video games like Resident Evil and Turok. Now you might also be thinking, well, simulation games have also been around even before Arma, but you have to also remember that simulation games are often specialized, like Flight Simulator, or Driving Simulator, or Farming Simulator, or Bullet Train Simulator? But these new survival games, which are also simulation games, aren't specialized or aren't really focused to be more arcadey. These survival simulation games have become the next evolution of realism in video games, where what's realistic isn't restricted to small gimmicks and fun little details. The realism in these survival simulation games is found in how that world that you are playing in functions even without your input. And this, I believe, is the step that these games take towards realism. So now that we have a master's degree in the history of how developers and audiences were enthralled by the idea of games being realistic, I now pose a question. Is there a limit on how far we can take realism in games? Or better yet, should there be a limit to how realistic we can let games be? And the obvious answer is yes. There's a limit, obviously. There should always be a limit to this kind of stuff. You see, video games are a medium of entertainment. Therefore, its main objective should always be to entertain. And to entertain means that it's fun to some degree. The race to realism can only go so far until a certain gameplay mechanic becomes tedious, or a vital part of a game becomes boring, or even worse, annoying. And then at that point, it's not fun anymore, is it? I know it's flashy to see a realistic stamina system, or realistic movement, or an open world game where you're forced to abide by the laws that are set in that world, but I think games always need to be separated from reality. I mean, the reason why we play games to begin with is because it's a form of escapism. Life will sometimes be boring, life will sometimes just be bad, and you might end up being sad in your life. And that's just a fact. And so games are there to distract us from that fact, even if it's just for a little bit. And I guess my point is, when video games start to mirror the real world, the world that you're having problems with, the world that you're trying to escape from just for a bit, then video games start to lose that sense of separation. And at that point, it almost just feels like you're looking out the window into the real world. Now trust me, I still love these hyper-realistic games. I love The Forest, and I especially love The Long Dark. But the reason why these games work really well is because they find a way to balance realism with fun gameplay. And this works really well with what I believe. I believe that games should stay as they're intended to be, as games. I feel like at its core, games should be focused on fun. And games will evolve, and they can evolve in terms of graphics and features and gameplay mechanics. But I think at the end of the day, games can be as realistic as they want to be. But it should never be at the expense of fun.